Welcome to the Healthcare Nation podcast. Your host, Rick Gannotta. Very happy to bring you another episode where today we're going to explore the search for truth in a post-truth world with a focus on science, medicine, clinical care, and emerging technologies. Couldn't think of a better guest to have on the show than Dr. Brian Southwell. Brian is the lead scientist for public understanding at RTI International, and his work there really is focused on improving public understanding of science through peer-reviewed publications as well as public commentary. He's also been a speaker in venues such as the Aspen Ideas Festival and has advised on projects such as NOVA, the Science Studio, and was part of the consensus study on misinformation about science for the National Academies of Science. He's also an adjunct faculty member at Duke and UNC and co-founded the Duke program on medical misinformation. And I would also say Brian is also a podcast host. He's got a great show on WNCU called The Measure of Everyday Life. So check that out as well. And without further ado, here's my guest, Dr. Brian Southwell. Welcome to the Healthcare Nation podcast. I'm your host, Rick Gannotta, and we're committed to bringing you thought leaders in the field to discuss what's new and noteworthy in the health sector. This is the Healthcare Nation podcast. Very excited today to be talking about a topic that has thematically come across the podcast, certainly over the last year, and that is the search for truth in what I've characterized as a post-truth world, particularly in the areas of science and medicine, clinical care, and emerging technology. And couldn't have a better guest than Dr. Brian Southwell. You heard his bio and background on there. So, Brian, so glad to have you on the show today.
I appreciate the invitation to be here.
I got so many questions for you, but let's just level set and start with understanding and communicating science. And one of the things, at least for me, give us a little bit of background on what you're doing at Research Triangle Institute and how that helps to shape the public perception of scientific concepts, which so many people, including myself, sometimes have a hard time understanding.
Yeah. So I have this role at RTI now, lead scientist for public understanding of science. And what the heck does that actually mean and constitute? It turns out that there's an awful lot that we take for granted about what people do and don't know. And I think that explains a lot of where we are in terms of resistance to or acceptance of different recommendations, concern about the state of the country in different ways. And so there's a lot of work that social scientists do to try to measure and understand what people understand, how they conceptualize different ideas, the ways in which how we talk about them might actually have an impact on their understanding. And that's the work that I've been involved with for quite a while now. And in a lot of ways, what we try to do is take an evidence-based approach to provide support for different ideas people have as to how to improve engagement with different audiences.
Yeah, I would say this, just hearing that, it's a challenge in itself. But when I think about just what's happened in technology, certainly over the last 20 years, the velocity, the acceleration, just the complexity of it. When I think about that, and I think about the challenges that you're facing in communicating what I would say and characterize as these complex concepts, what do you see as the biggest challenges that are coming out right now? Perhaps, yes, in the digital realm, but not limited to that.
Yeah. One of the big changes is this fragmentation, across the media landscape. And on some level, there are opportunities in that. There are many folks, yourself included, that are now part of that landscape that perhaps, 20 or 30 years ago, wouldn't have been. And that's really important. I think it's opening up the door for lots of different voices that contribute in important ways. The pace that you talked about is something that we pay a lot of attention to. Imagine there is problematic content or a belief or an idea that people are, mulling over, thinking about. Well, now with the click of a button, they can share that with 1,000 of their closest friends. And that's something that I do tend to worry quite a bit about. It's just the pacing and timing of discourse, the way in which ideas turn over so quickly. It can be destabilizing in really important ways. And so that's something definitely to pay attention to. On some level, though, we've also been here before. There is an aspect to our humanity, to our history of engagement with one another that we also need to pay attention to. We can talk some more about that, but it's not as though we are in an altogether unfamiliar landscape. We are still talking about human beings trying to come together and talk about, make sense of the world.
I have to just kind of go in a little tangent because I think about the power of storytelling and messaging. And it seems like, yeah, there's a lot of that in it. It's just who owns the story and where's the credibility and validity in that? I mean, that's what comes to mind when I think about the power of, historical narrative and what that means.
Yeah, and we know that narrative is really important for the way that people process and make sense of the world. And so those that are able to capitalize on that, I do think have an advantage in different ways. People are looking for stories. They're trying to understand how to make sense of what is a complicated, fast-paced, complex world in different ways. And so I usually approach a lot of this though from a standpoint of empathy, for all of us as we're trying to make our way through what is a muddled, complicated, world. And part of the way that we do that is looking for the stories. And so what can we do to actually facilitate and make sure that those stories are accurate and that those stories aren't necessarily just playing on stereotypes or that they aren't, relying on evidence, which isn't really particularly useful.
Yeah, let me pivot for a second. I've always, certainly on the business side of literally what I do for a living and what I've done for many, many years, I've always said behind every narrative, there's numbers, and behind every set of numbers, there's a narrative. And I'm using that because, science has always been about truth. And I've always thought mathematics is the queen of sciences, right? Across the board. And in that respect, when you think about reconciling, as I said earlier, what's true, what's factual in this world of so many different versions of the truth, how do we approach that? And maybe more specifically, how do we reconcile that in the world of clinical care in
Mm.
medicine and how we are taking care of folks, whether it's a pandemic situation all the way through to just decision making on what is a good public health measure.
I think the single biggest challenge that we face, and this is something that gets lost in the shuffle and a lot of our worry and dismay about, the situation that we're in right now, is the fact that scientists, researchers, for a long time have been endeavoring to, understand an accurate version of and to try to grasp an accurate understanding of our world. And so it's not as though that's necessarily changed. What has been lost in the shuffle is that people don't necessarily understand how science operates. They don't understand that it is a matter of formulating a question and then through iteration actually trying to come up with evidence that is going to perhaps disprove a hypothesis. It might undermine a hypothesis, but we're constantly iterating and testing. And I think if people have better understood that that's what clinicians are sometimes doing, that's what researchers are sometimes doing, I think there'd be more acceptance of the idea that the headlines can change, sometimes. And I think that if we did a better job of actually explaining this whole endeavor and saying, look, it's not perfect, but it's better than a lot of other alternatives in terms of a path forward, and that the information that can come out of science can be predictive, can be useful for all of us, and it can actually give us a better sense of where we might be headed. That's something I think people can buy into rather than this team sport that we often tend to play. And frankly, I think that clinicians, scientists, researchers, others are also sometimes guilty of playing exactly along those same rules of saying, well, look, I'm team science. I know all the answers. That I think is the problem. That we don't necessarily showing our hands. We aren't necessarily suggesting here's the process by which we got to this point. And previewing the idea that, look, some of this might change. Recommendations might change, 6 months from now. We certainly saw that during the course.
Yeah, it makes me think back to a podcast that we had, and now it's been over a year ago, with Art Kaplan, the bioethicist out of NYU. And I think the world of art. We're talking about truth in much the same kind of conversation that we're having now. But he brought up, and I'm paraphrasing, the fact that there could be more than one truth. It depends upon who is looking at that truth, and
Yeah.
it's a little bit like the observer effect in that sense. But that I was taken by that. And I wonder if we went back 50 years ago, you wouldn't have the, opportunity to have multiple choices in what is credible and reliable and valid, because we didn't have the kind of structural communication, whether it be social media or other, I would say, ways of conveying a message. And we didn't have what I would also characterize as perhaps the tribes that we have now, and those really, polarizing viewpoints. I mean, what are your thoughts on that? Right?
So I think it is the case that people can have different perspectives on, even the same, object and the same truths in different ways. They can be operating from a different vantage point, and that makes a lot of sense. I think it's possible for us to both acknowledge that there is possibility for different perspectives while still suggesting that there are some things that we probably can come to agreement on. There is a reality that we live in. And that's something that I think philosophically, some people might want to take it to the extreme and suggest, look, there's no way for us, any of us, to be sort of in the same universe. I think that's problematic in itself. I think that there's a lot of evidence that we are all living together on this earth, and that there may well be different vantage points on certain ideas. You know, Scientists themselves often come up with different hypotheses and different perspectives, but there is such a thing as evidence that can be generated that we can agree, look, we're going to play by these rules and do our best with that. And there's an awful lot of situations, there are an awful number of situations where, having done that, we've predicted fairly well what was going to come. And that, and for me, is reason to believe that it is still the case that we could imagine having some shared bodies of evidence for certain types of questions.
Yeah, and I think the rules that you mentioned, and this is my perception, there's rules that you could say are scientific rules, but there may also be rules and guardrails in the political realm that have a totally different rule set, and as well as the rules that are in this public opinion and the public square. And right off the bat, it at the very least, I would say it's more than can nuance a truth.
Well, I think the big challenge that we often face is that we end up being ships passing in the night. We're not sort of recognizing why there's this miscommunication. We haven't done is been transparent about what the values are that we might be talking about. So in a lot of ways, what you're raising is the fact that certain types of perspectives, certain types of groups may well hold certain values more or less dear. I think if we were transparent about that, it might be more clear. Well, look, this outcome matters to me for this reason. Here are the rules, in this particular discussion. So for me, transparency would take us a long way. Transparency as to what our motives are, transparency as to what our values are. We may not come to a full agreement as to what all of those values might be, but I think the basis for trust in a lot of ways is a sense of shared interest, a sense of shared values. And I think that there actually are many more instances where there is possibility for that than not. And that's something that is a bit of a tragedy that we're missing that in the current situation.
No, great points. Great points. Let me talk a little bit about the mistrust and misinformation piece specifically, and maybe more along the lines of what you think are the root causes of this. And just have my notes here, and I really wanted to ask you this question: if you had to kind of distill it down, what do you see as the primary causes of growing mistrust in science, particularly in the context of health and healthcare?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I would note, actually, is that there is a considerable amount of trust that continues to exist.
Right.
That has been lost in the headlines.
Right. And I should say, nursing being the most trusted profession, right?
100%. And so let's not lose sight of that, because it's probably never been the case that we've had 100% of people in this country who fully believed in all institutions. We've always had folks that had reasons for dissent. We've always had folks that felt, somewhat alienated. So that in and of itself doesn't necessarily, shock me. And in fact, if you look at the academic literature, at the evidence on trust, it's actually fairly stable over decades. Now, there are numbers of folks who have expressed mistrust, and we do see some variation. And I think that part of what we've lost is sort of we've moved from a couple of places where people are coming together, watching the same television channels. We now have this wide and varied landscape. We overlook the fact that we've got new generations of people kind of aging into the public square, if you will. And so if we don't have people that have grown up with and have a sense for what these institutions are for, what these scientific institutions are for, how they operate, it makes sense that they might well question, where that's coming from when a particular recommendation comes out. And we also have to think about the flattening of the landscape, currently. So I might have an authoritative, source that I'm looking at, but I can flip pretty easily on my phone to something else from some other part of the internet that isn't. And so that makes sense that people might well be confused. There's all kinds of information that's out there. I tend to think that people, generally speaking, want to keep themselves healthy. They want to keep their families healthy. They want to have good information. People, for the most part, most of the time, are not particularly interested in trafficking in or engaging in or consuming misinformation as such. Doesn't mean they don't run into faulty information sometimes. It doesn't mean they run into information that's not science-based, and that there might be reasons for them to believe in that. But I don't think that people actively want to go out into the world and seek misinformation, say, hey, give me some of that. I really would like low quality information that's not grounded in any kind of evidence. And so I think we misunderstand the problem, by and large, which is that people are working through their everyday lives. They don't necessarily have training in the sciences. They don't necessarily have the background or experience, and they're just trying to make sense of what is a complicated situation and which of these guidelines should I follow? What should I do to keep my kid healthy? And I think that that is part of the situation that we're in right now. You combine that with the fact that information can fly around the world really quickly. That's another challenge. And I think altogether that suggests why we might have, some of this situation that we do right now, which is a situation in which not everybody is paying attention to the same sources. Not everybody knows where to turn to. And sometimes you've got folks putting out official announcements and wondering why people aren't listening. And there's a lot of good reasons for that.
Yeah. And Brian, let me ask you this. Is there, by the way, I'm fascinated even about mentioning TV. I'm wondering, like, in England, there was only BBC One, BBC Two. I mean, did that change things? But maybe more to explore and expand on what you're saying. Are there psychological components to this as well that would influence or bias someone? I want to look for a certain type of information, therefore I'm biased towards that versus not.
Well, there's many aspects to this, and some of it's not altogether easy to suggest it's all been good or bad. So we have an expansion of the media landscape, different ways, right? And so now you see lots of different perspectives, different types of people, telling their stories, on TV. And you also see through advertising and through other, channels, lots of efforts to reach particular audiences and an acknowledgement that not all audiences are the same. So this whole notion that we might target market, certain ideas, people are also aware of the fact that there are these other communities, that are out there in different ways. We've expanded the sense of potential competition in the world for resources. We've expanded the sense that there are all these different viewpoints and perspectives. That's good on some level, but I think there's also a level in which people recognize that it is a vastly complicated world, that not every piece of information that's out there is crafted specifically for them, and I think there's an acknowledgement of that. And I think that some of this is partly economic, as people understand there is a world full of other individuals, other communities, and I'm going to first protect and think about my own resources first, I think is sometimes the perspective that we see.
Yeah. I want to suspend the notion of, let's just say, social media right now, and just think about what I would consider straight line sources of credible information, say clinical credible information on a diagnosis or an illness or something. Is there anything that you would suggest a consumer who has their hand on the lever of where they're looking for care? Is there a right way or a best way to approach that for them?
Yeah. So this is a great question. And I think our initial instinct is to take advantage of the quite powerful search engines that we have and to look for answers. And we know that those search engines will yield a lot of
Mhm.
information, but they won't necessarily always yield it, in a neatly packaged way that suggests what's credible and what's not. There are folks at the different entities that are working on that. I think we need to do a better job of, labeling and suggesting here are sources that are relying on, credible information. In fact, there do seem to be some efforts to do that. YouTube's announced
Mhm.
some efforts in that regard. But generally speaking, there's two things that people can keep in mind. First, and this might sound counterintuitive in this world of information that we have, but I actually think that it makes sense for you to really think about the sources that you're turning to and perhaps to limit, the diet that you have, and to not necessarily be just wandering all over the internet, but rather thinking about here are sources that, have been useful, that are, seem to be credible. I'm going to turn back to that as a first place to go when I have questions. Also, a lot of this, many people continue to have the opportunity to have a relationship with a healthcare professional. And some of this can be done in conjunction, with them, of course. And we do see that to be an important relationship. But I think, ultimately limiting the number of sources, but then also trying to get people to recognize that it sometimes is the case that things are too good to be true when you find them, that taking a deep breath, slowing down, this whole notion that's encouraged sometimes for people to read laterally, to sort of look at sort of additional perspectives and to recognize that something that you encounter may not be, the final answer that you want to encounter. That's also important, I think. So those couple of tactics alone would actually clear up a fair amount of the confusion. We're not going to have any panacea that's going to deal with 100% of the misinformation that's out there. We're not going to have any magic tactic that's going to allow people to find good information at all points. But I do think that generally speaking, knowing going into it when you're looking for information, being intentional about the sources that you're actually turning to, and not necessarily fully taking advantage of the fact that almost any of the most powerful search engines out there right now will answer either through generative AI or just through old fashioned algorithms. They'll give you a lot of information to look at pretty quickly in response to your question, and just recognizing that's not the same as necessarily high quality information that you might get.
How about when we're challenged with, say, ads on TV? And I'm thinking about pharma. We see Ozempic and Wegovy, et cetera, and the powerful influence that that has perceptually, credible, you could see this on TV, et cetera, or read it coming from, a well-established brand. It almost seems like that is a level of influence that I don't want to say crosses the line, but it's in the space that, and we talk about a lot on the show, this retail kind of consumer influence space. Love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, resources matter,
Mhm.
right? And we know that visual imagery can be a powerful way to engage people. That if you have the money to spend on reaching audiences, that you're going to be in a better spot to do that than institutions that don't. That's the media landscape that we have right now. And I think that's important to keep in mind. It's important for people to recognize that sometimes the loudest voices or the most polished aren't necessarily always, the only place that people ought to turn or could turn, for information. But if you think about it, folks that are operating from a nonprofit perspective or folks that are operating from a government agency perspective, they may not necessarily have the same media budget, and that's important. And I'm not sure that that's necessarily always fully comprehended by all people. But we do have a landscape where it's possible to put out quite slick and classy campaigns. Some of those may well be offering useful information for people that they want to have, but it does sometimes potentially crowd out the possibility for different types of information campaigns, which may be less slick, but which might be more grounded in evidence. So that is a difficult thing. The other thing, though, that I think is important to keep in mind, and this isn't a comment necessarily just on advertising, because on some level, our broadcast advertising arena is regulated, to some extent. But if you look across the landscape, at the internet more broadly, something that I think is really important to keep in mind is that if you are a scientific researcher and you're really certain about a particular idea, and you've found evidence for this hypothesis, you're worried, you're concerned, you want to let people know about this. The basic practice that you've typically pursued is to publish a peer-reviewed article, which takes a while to come out. There are certain rules you have to play by. Be very cautious with your language. There are formats and formulas. Those peer-reviewed articles are often locked up behind a paywall. Even if they're available in open access, they aren't necessarily written in the most accessible language. You compare that with the person who just has no rules, no constraints on them professionally at all. All they have to do is seek attention, and so on some level, the folks that are crafting misinformation aren't playing an equal sport, an equal game, with folks who are operating from the standpoint of peer review. Doesn't mean that we can't try to level that playing field somewhat, but I do think that there's an oversight there that people don't realize all the constraints that professionals are typically under trying to offer their messages. And maybe we could move to a spot where people are a little bit less worried about the caveats and more worried about the gist and the bottom line that people are understanding. And I think there's more work for different scientific organizations to do to be reaching audiences in ways that are translated well and that reach them where they are and that resonate with their everyday lives.
Yeah, now let me go into an area where I won't say the bar is lowered, but the bar is different if it exists at all, and even walking into the world of free speech, and that is social media kind of writ large. And I know this is an area where you have considerable focus on, and I think so many individuals, at least that I talk to, they get so much information, and that's a totally different podcast, obviously. But I'd love to hear from you. How has social media in general shaped public perceptions of healthcare and healthcare's role as a credible, entity across the board? And yes, I'm thinking about, did this change during the pandemic? Was that was that a break point? Has it been this way? I mean, I'd love to have your thoughts on that, Brian.
Yeah, I think there have been limits in the basis for public opinion, for a long time. In a lot of ways, we've seen remarkable fluidity that sometimes is a good thing, sometimes is a negative thing, in terms of how people think about and change their mind on certain issues for decades. And so it's not as though social media is, the sole cause of the situation that we're in. I do think that the architecture of social media is important to keep in mind. So, there are social networks, essentially embedded within the distribution patterns, for social media content, which means that you might all be on the same platform, but you've got different people paying attention to different other, nodes in their network. And so it may well be the case that you're not even aware of, what's going on in this part of the platform altogether. That's something that is difficult for, civic society to really fully grapple with, because it's not as though we're all paying attention to what Walter Cronkite said, on the evening news. And it's not as though we've ever all, necessarily done
Mhm.
that, but there was at least a greater hope. And so that's something, the lack of transparency, the invisibility of some conversations that are happening, that's something I think we need to pay, some attention to. I also think it's the case that there is an anonymity, even though you are often identified, on a social media platform. We know that it's the case that some people are, not very, well connected necessarily, or not even fully, accountable or visible in terms of what they're often posting. And so that can be encouraging for people to be, extreme in their comments. I think that we've lost some of the humanity in our interactions, that, people have long been able to be violent to one another, even in person, but there's something really lost, I think, in an exchange where you might just be a comment on somebody's, other post without necessarily having to take the whole person into account. That I worry. I think that it's coarsened, our discourse in important ways, and it's encouraged some people to just, not engage in that at all together. The other thing we've got to keep in mind is that when we talk about social media platforms, we're typically not talking about something in which 100% of the population is engaged. And so there are now different platforms where different, age groups and different, generations are more or less engaged. And there's a whole set of people for whom, these type of social media platforms aren't even really still a thing at all. And we've got to keep those people in mind as well, I think, forward.
Yeah, I was going to go down that line of questioning. Is there fragmentation as you're seeing stratification, age, gender, anything that's
Yeah.
profound in the research that you
Well,
see?
yeah. I mean, if you look at, what the most used platforms or people that have experience or engagement with particular platforms, you certainly see some generational changes, over time. And you look at something like Meta or Facebook as something that once upon a time had, quite a bit of popularity. I think amongst, younger generations now, I mean, people might be more likely to be on, TikTok or uh, a variant of Meta on Instagram, or other types of platforms. And so that's something that I do think we can't make the leap to assume that, what we see trending on social media is equivalent to public opinion, per se. And that's something I think a lot of journalists make a mistake in this regard. I've seen what I think, unfortunately, has been some lazy journalism in a tendency to turn to, social media posts as evidence of what people are saying. So rather than being out on the street asking people, instead you just scraping a few, posts off of, what's now called, X, for example, and assuming that we're going to put that together into a story and here's what people are thinking about this. No, it's not necessarily the best sample of, what, people across America are thinking. And so then that ends up itself into the media, into the stream of what gets reported, and it almost reifies it in a way. And I sort of worry about that, because I think that, investigative journalism, which isn't often very well funded, but could be going further to try to, get a broader sense of what people, think than just what they're posting on social media.
Yeah, is there any I don't know if there any research that's out there that is drawing a line between, say, at the generational
Yeah.
side of things, vaccine perceptions versus, you know, an older population, Gen X versus Gen Z, et cetera?
Oh, well, certainly with regards to, there's lots of different ways to, compare,
Yeah,
different
and I'm looking for
populations.
is there a link to social media or that kind of
Oh,
influence?
that's interesting. I don't know that I would necessarily go down that road, because we certainly see there has been a growth in adoption, amongst even, older generations, with certain types of social media engagement. I think the thinking about the nature of one's networks and social networks is important. I'm not sure that we can necessarily lay blame just on the technology, per se, because it's humans that are using the
Mm.
technology for different reasons, right? And so it's people that are opting into the reasons why teenagers might find it less useful to be in one social media platform and more useful to be on another. But they're bringing with them some of their perspectives and ideas. I think in terms of generational divides, around certain types of acceptance of health behaviors, you know, there are a whole host of reasons why people may be resistant to a particular recommendation, and I think another mistake that we make sometimes is to assume that that's a monolithic group that's somehow been influenced by some misperception that's out there or some technology. When in fact there are a lot of structural reasons too, which suggest people are in different circumstances. They have lots of reasons for making the decisions that they do.
Yeah, great points, really. Look, no one gets out of the podcast without talking about technology and particularly the changes that we're seeing there. And specifically, let's talk about AI, artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
Let's talk about how is this transforming, and does it relate at all to the whole question of truth? When we think about algorithms or who's building out a machine learning concept
Mhm.
and everything we hear about biases, how does that play
Yeah.
out, Brian?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure that we know yet how all of it's going to play out. And I do think there are choices that could be made along the way too in terms of how that plays out. That said, I can imagine scenarios in which you can use, large language models, generative artificial intelligence, to produce content that, seems to draw on a really coherent, evidence-based set of knowledge, and it can be reasonable for certain types of application. But I also think that there's possibility there. We've seen that, for generative AI to, hallucinate, ideas, to draw on ideas and put them together in a way that suggests the opposite conclusion, and that's problematic. And I think we have to think about validating the results that we get. It could be potentially a useful first pass, a rough draft that needs to be vetted and checked in certain ways, certainly in the context of thinking about clinicians drawing upon and using that information. And yet I could also imagine applications where this could help sort through, the just billions of data points that you otherwise have. And so I don't think it's a either or question. I think that there are possibilities that with continued oversight, continued emphasis on ethics, continued emphasis on what it means to be human, that we could imagine tools that would be useful for us. I don't think we're ever going to lose the importance of human beings asking questions and sort of generating the process, and that's something that I think gets lost in this discussion sometimes. There is going to be continued need for human involvement and engagement, I think, all along the way.
Yeah, I don't even know how I can reconcile misinformation with in an AI kind of a scenario. If you're querying a large language model and you're asking it a question, it's going to respond to that based on your prompt and what
Right.
line of I mean, even in there, there's a level of less than credible accuracy that can be built into its response based on the answer. Right?
Right. Well, and this is we have to go back to, I think, a more grounded definition and conceptualization of even misinformation than sometimes is apparent in the headlines. So with misinformation, we shouldn't just be focused on differences of opinion per se, but we should be thinking about the instances where there's egregious contrast between what's presented and what we know to be the case based on evidence. There are areas of knowledge, of inquiry, for which we haven't done the research yet. So it's probably not the case that we're going to have misinformation, because you're not going to have a discordance between what's generated in the evidence base if there is no evidence base. So there are some areas of inquiry where it is something that we're all kind of exploring together. But then there are other instances where there's a really good evidence base, for a particular recommendation. And at the very least, I think people have the right to know when there is something that's being said that stands at direct odds with that. And so for me, I tend to think about it less in terms of who owns the capital T truth, and instead, to what extent is there agreement between what's being presented and all this hard work that people have done into gathering evidence, and And for me, that's really the biggest problem is that there are sometimes instances where people are completely ignoring what's been done to gather this peer reviewed evidence, and that to me seems like an oversight. And I tend to think that a lot of good can come out of science. A lot of bad things can in the wrong hands or with the wrong ethical choices happen as well. People are not perfect. Humans are not perfect in doing the science that they do. But I think that as a way of moving forward, it's a fairly good one for society to hold on to.
How about your thoughts on what's happening on Capitol Hill? I'm not obviously just from a bipartisan perspective, activity there, the regulatory side. Do you think there's enough attention on the issue and everything we've talked about thus far?
Yeah, so something that we shouldn't take for granted in this country is that there actually are, areas of the information environment that have regulatory oversight.
Mhm.
And so, a model for how we might think about and address, misinformation, we can turn to areas where we've made conscious decisions, for there to be, some degree of regulatory oversight. So, the Food and Drug Administration is a great example of this. There are, you talked a little while ago about, ads that are produced, direct to consumers. Well, there are claims that you can get in trouble for making an ads, like those. And it is the case that there are agencies that are not preventing necessarily information from ever making its way onto the airwaves, but that something can be done if there is an egregious oversight that's recognized and brought to their attention. So I think we have to balance, when it comes to regulation, something that's really crucial, I think, are values that we all hold dear that relate to the openness of our media system. There is a world you could imagine where we would have draconian, censorship. Mhm. And the way that I've just phrased it suggests it's probably not a good thing, right? I mean,
Right. Yeah.
but that's so there's a cost in us having the open media system that we do. I personally feel like that's generally a good thing, that we live in a society that, allows for some of the free flow of information. But some of the cost of that is some of this messiness that we're talking. Where I worry less is, or where I worry more is when people are led astray and they don't have full sense and transparency as to what the sources of their information might be, and or when information is knowingly presented, as true when it's knowingly false, or when it's at odds with other information. Those are instances where I think we can collectively decide to do something about that. The social media platforms, themselves, they are part of our broader society. We often want to turn, very quickly to the notion of the First Amendment and freedom of speech. But, platforms themselves don't necessarily, have to stick to all of you know, those perspectives. There is speech that is protected, but that's different than suggesting that you are going to be putting together this service privately for users. And there are choices that could be made, along the way.
Yeah, I know you have obviously a deep commitment to academia and your research side of things, starting centers. How are we doing on the higher ed side, on the educational piece? Are we addressing the issues? Is there enough conversation, discourse, or even, I would say, research that's going into understanding the issues?
Yeah, no, there's a lot more that we could do, I think, with regards to higher education. I'm a deep believer in the value of higher education and making it as accessible as possible to as many people as possible. I think it is a really important part of the landscape and the fabric of this country and many others. I don't think we do nearly enough to both invest in that and to cherish and embrace the opportunity we have with higher education. Within the realm of education, there are some things that we could be doing better as well. We could be doing a better job of telling the story of how scientific research happens, even for folks that aren't going to go into capital S science unprofessionally. I think we could be doing a better job of actually exposing people to the mechanisms and the processes of science. If we were to do that, then perhaps later when they're making judgments about particular claims, they would have a basis for understanding what produced those in different ways. And they also would perhaps have more tolerance for, as we talked about before, the constantly changing, headlines sometimes, which seems to be the case. But there's another aspect, the folks that are professionally going into science, that we could be doing a better job of training. Could be doing a better job of training people, like yourself, to engage with and to offer translations for different audiences and to be just doing a better job of communicating about the work that they do. This is something that I've been a part of in different places at Duke University and other places. They've started to put together workshops and training for folks that are in science, technology, engineering, mathematics to think about public audiences, to think about how it is they might translate their work for those groups and to communicate with those groups. So I think that needs to be a required part of the training of folks that are going to go into those different professions. And if we did that, we would have more experts available to be quoted by journalists. We'd have more folks available to be leading some of these discussions. And we saw some of that, I think, during the pandemic, but I think there's room for more.
Yeah, no, again, good points. Can't leave it all to the science guy, right? I mean, Bill
Right.
Nye, there's no doubt. Let me ask you this. When you think about the global approach to this, and I know it's probably a lot of variability and uneven uptake with respect to where information is communicated, how it's communicated, who has access to it, depending upon what country or region you're in. Any thoughts on that? What's happening global?
Well, I mean, we do live in a world that's interconnected in different ways, and that something that often comes to mind for me though is I think that we overlook the real structural disparities which exist.
Mhm.
And so you know people have some access, but even so, we still are have issues with even internet access around the world in different ways. And we also have to overlay on top of that, the different reality, the different political realities and governance, that exists in different countries. So assuming that information can kind of freely flow, around the world, that doesn't quite happen. We know that there are different regimes in place in different parts of the world. And I think that we lull ourselves to sleep, sometimes with the false premise that somehow that the internet has fully democratized the world, and that while people have access to it, they can just hop on a search engine and find whatever they need. We know that people are in lots of different challenging circumstances, and so if you are asking for a family who is having trouble figuring out where the clean sources of water are in their neighborhood, which might happen in the US, might happen in other parts of the world, and they're dealing with that kind of stress on a daily basis. And then you're also asking them to kind of make sense and heads and tails of a vaccination decision by, comparing articles on the internet. I mean, it's not necessarily a fair, thing to expect everybody to have the same kind of, leisure time, the same kind of access to resources. So even though the information might be out there and be available, we still have to pay attention to the lived reality that many people face, which is one of quite a bit of structural disparity.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. What is the future, Brian, of science communication and really conveying with, I would say, integrity?
Mhm.
It's the really important points that we touched upon today.
Yeah, so for me, I think there's an ideal and a possibility for communication in a more pure sense. What I mean by that is if you think about communication, so often we think about it just solely in terms of broadcast and presentation of information. But a really key part of communication is also the interchange between two parties or between people in an audience, and so listening becomes a really important verb, in that. And so for me, I think we could probably be doing a better job, and I'm hopeful that different institutions are going to open the door to really monitoring the pulse of what people are thinking. That itself can inform the scientific process in different ways. You can imagine instances in which people are still able to exercise their expertise in coming up with evidence, but perhaps some of the questions they're asking are driven a bit more by audience interests and needs. I think if we had a bit more of that, you might have then a nice reciprocal effect of more trust in institutions as well. And so I think opening the dialogue in a two-way street, not to suggest that somehow people are going to be out there doing their own research, on their own. I think there's still a place for expertise. There's still a place, a really important place, in fact, more than ever, for scientific knowledge. But we could have that process be informed a bit more by the expressed needs of different communities. And I think that might actually help quite a bit. I think part of what you see is a group of people that many people that feel alienated or feel disconnected from these different institutions don't feel like there's a sense of shared interest between them and those institutions. And I think if you had a greater sense of that people would be willing to, to defer a bit more than they sometimes are, and to say, look, I know you're working in my interest, so you go out and figure out, the best way to answer this particular question, which is, addressing, which is really facing all of us. I mean, and that was the the big challenge of the pandemic. Gosh, so many people around the world we were all in it
Yeah.
together, and people were doing their best to try to make us their way through. And I think there's a lot to celebrate. I think there's a lot that we actually accomplished, and even though it wasn't perfect. And so I'd like to see us in a spot where we're sort of realizing that we can use science for our benefit, and that's not necessarily just an us versus them situation.
Yeah. And hopefully the shared alignment and incentive kicks in as well, which is at the end of the day, as you said, we're all in it together.
Right.
So yeah, here to that. Look, we usually wrap up with a couple questions that are maybe a little bit more personal.
Yeah.
And one for you is tell me about your journey in science communication. What motivated you to focus in this area that you are, I think, have really achieved a level of notoriety and content expertise that
Yeah.
is, really it's something that I really admire. So
Mm.
tell us about that.
Well, I appreciate that. For me, I've actually long been interested in the possibilities for communication, in different ways. At an earlier stage in my career, I used to do a bit of work on the side, documentary production, toying around with that, or thinking about, writing, thinking about, ways in which, people were brought together in different venues. I've always been fascinated by the ways that people can be inspired, and there's a quote, Edward R. Murrow, a number of years ago, talking about television, and I'm paraphrasing, but he essentially said, well, there's this remarkable, instrument, but it really is dependent on the ends to which people are going to put it to use. Otherwise, it's just lights and wires in a box, right? And so for me, having early on been really interested in possibilities for media production, possibilities for rhetoric, always been inspired by, the great speeches of the past and the civil rights movement and other instances where people really did make a difference by what they said. I really had to think hard about what are the ways that might be applied from my standpoint ethically, for the greater good. And so I got involved in, work as a social scientist, and then my training is really in that regard at the University of Pennsylvania, for example, where I did my doctoral work. How could that be applied, to the issues of public health that we're facing, to issues of, engagement and worry about all that science could bring? And so I got involved with a number of different institutions over time. The Center for Disease Control and Prevention is one example, back in the 1990s, and recognized that there was a role, for somebody like me to help with folks that were, doing the important, scientific research to help bridge that gap, and to recognize that I think by and large, I've always had this deep faith and optimism that people actually would appreciate, that the work that's being done. People generally want, a better, world for us all to live in. And so part of the reason for the miscommunication or the distrust or the mistrust is a matter of communication. And I think that it plays a really vital role. So I've always seen myself as potentially, if doing anything, maybe offering a bit of bridge building. Always been inspired by people that were willing to do that. And to be a bit cynical or worried about, the tendency of humans and groups, I've also recognized that work isn't going to happen unless somebody, opts to do it sort of voluntarily almost, that there's not necessarily as much incentive for people to build a bridge. It's everybody benefits from it once it's built, and so that's been something I've always been inspired to try to work on, myself, is just to be in those spaces where no one group or institution necessarily owns it, but what could be done to kind of improve the public square, improve the bridges that are built, electronically or otherwise.
I think sometimes it's also a landscape that's filled with difficult conversations at times too, as you sort through things. And in that regard, what guidance would you offer to young folks who are really thinking about going into the world of science and communication and having an impact factor that they can scale?
Yeah. Well, I think so. We often, think about the ways in which, we just have been through a holiday season with Thanksgiving, here in the US. The Thanksgiving dinner table, is a metaphorical place of struggle and opportunity for so many of us, right? Because you're coming together with people from friends and family and trying to talk perhaps even about the work that you're doing and realizing that isn't going to go particularly well. But I think we can't stop there. I think that you've got to recognize that, for the most part, if there is an instance where you're hitting a roadblock, in a conversation, to what extent can you take some ownership and recognize that at least part of the reason why that may not be going well, part of the reason you may not have a shared, vision is because of what you're doing and articulating what you're saying. And so it may not be all of it, but really trying to take, some responsibility and to recognize, and ask yourself the question, is there anything else I could be doing to try to better explain this? And I think that those of us that have opportunities, to be parents over time recognize the importance of that. But, being a good friend, being in any good relationship is also partly about, reciprocation. It's also about mutual respect and empathy, and just recognizing that at the end of the day, what's in your head may not be what in the other person's head. And so that's frustrating, but it also means there's room for optimism, because it means that you might be able to actually better explain what's in your head to that other person, and get them on the same page.
And you said listening is such an important part of that. And I will say this, I have enjoyed listening to you today, as I am sure our audience has as well. We're going to have you back, my friend. This has been a fantastic show, and thank you for being on the Healthcare Nation podcast and for all the work you're doing.
Well, and likewise, thanks for everything you're doing. You're putting a spotlight on really crucial issues. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Brian. The opinions expressed by the host and guests are for informational purposes only and not associated with any companies or academic institutions. Please follow us wherever you listen to your podcasts, as well as our YouTube channel, Healthcare Nation Podcast. And if you have any questions or want to contact us, please reach out to healthcarenationpodcast.com.